to Darius and Pyracetes were born two sons, the older Artaxerxes and the younger Cyrus. So begins the adventure book called the Anabasis of Cyrus, or the Expedition of Cyrus, by Xenophon the Athenian. In this intrepid tale, a heterogeneous group of Greek mercenaries travelled far to the east to help Cyrus take the Persian throne from Artaxerxes, but instead found themselves isolated and far from home, forced to make a daring retreat through hostile territory in the heart of Iran. We will explore the story of ancient Hellas's blockbuster thriller, from the incursion into Persia to the Battle of Cunaxa to the retreat into Armenia and the epic fight in the service of the Thracian king. Welcome to our video on the Anabasis, the story of Xenophon and the 10,000, and the perils they faced on their long journey home. Before we delve into the contents of the Anabasis of Cyrus, we must first understand its author, as well as the king after whom the book is named. Xenophon was an Athenian statesman and mercenary from the demos of Achaea. He was a student of Socrates amidst the turmoil of the Peloponnesian War, and would later become a sympathizer of the Spartan political system. Most notably, he was one of the Greek mercenaries who ended up stranded in the heart of Persia, making his thrilling tale of daring do, in essence, an autobiography. Xenophon was clearly a deeply religious man, made apparent in his writing, which devotes page space to examining the virtues and vices of the characters in the Anabasis. The text's reason for being written is unclear. Some consider it to be a form of response to political enemies in Athens, who saw him as a Medizer, ergo culturally compromised Persia lover, or an analysis of his ideas and reflection of his actions during the campaign of the 10,000 to Persia and back. Others point out how Xenophon uses events to discuss ethical themes based on events in the campaign, such as piety or breaking oaths. Xenophon was initially unsure of whether to go to Persia to fight, and was possibly seen through hostile eyes by other Athenians due to his political beliefs, which were more oligarchic than Athens could tolerate after the 30 tyrants. He thus asked his teacher Socrates for help, who sent him to the Pythia. The oracle replied cryptically as ever, and eventually, ignoring a cautious Socrates' advice, Xenophon set forth for the land where Yazatas and Ahuras are said to reside. Cyrus, the younger son of the Persian Shahanshah, was keen to take over the throne of Persia from his older brother Artaxerxes. Xenophon speaks highly of the young prince's prestigious education, as well as his proficiency in the bow and arrow. As satrap in Asia Minor, Cyrus had no backing by the noble families of the court, and so had little help in making his case for the throne. Despite this, Cyrus had his own pool of support to draw upon. His involvement in Greek affairs during the Peloponnesian War had left him with Hellenic connections, whose hired soldiers he used to fight various local tribes, along with his local nemesis, the satrap Tissaphernes. The mercenaries Cyrus used to fight his battles for him came from all over Hellas, a heterogeneous group which became known as the Myrii, or the 10,000. This group, which included many elite troops of various styles, Xenophon amongst them, was to help him take the throne from Artaxerxes. In 401 BCE, the Myrii set off from Sardis to deliver salvation unto their Persian benefactor. Much like the Persian Yazata of the Moon, Ma, was said to have saved the soul of the first bovine, Gevivadatta. It must have seemed like a new Iliad for the Greek troops, an adventure for glory and money in an eastern land, but little did they know they were to be a part of the eternal fratricides of Persian monarchies so eloquently seen in the Shahnameh, the Persian national epic written by Ferdowsi. The army that set off from Sardis was composed not just of the 10,000, but also 1,000 Paphlagonian cavalry, 700 Spartan hoplites, 2,500 peltasts and light infantry, 60 chariots with scythes, as well as a contingent of Persian troops amassed by Cyrus. During the first stretch of their springtime march, they encountered logistical issues in their supply of food. This created tensions in the army, which bubbled over in Cilicia when one of the generals, the Spartan Clearchus, faced rebellion amongst the troops. The soldiers also began to realize that they were not being sent to a rebelling province, but straight to the army of the Shahanshah, or King of Kings of Persia. which made them even more anxious. One of the ringleaders of this mutiny was flogged by Clearchus, but this only caused more distress. Only the promise of more pay by Cyrus was enough to dissuade further revolts. As the army reached Syria, they hoped to take supplies from fish in the river, but the local population was said to worship fish and thus refused to let the Greeks do so. Afterwards, the army marched until they reached the Euphrates River and finally began collecting food and supplies. Meanwhile, Artaxerxes was informed of his upstart brother's rebel force and amassed his army to face his rogue sibling, composed of 40,000 troops, as well as 150 to 200 Seuthes chariots and 6,000 bodyguard cavalry. Their battle was to take place at a site north of Babylon called Cunaxa. Upon approaching the battlefield, Cyrus encountered a trench set up by Artaxerxes, and initially expected the battle to begin there. However, the ditch was abandoned, so Cyrus ordered his troops around it. Clearchus moved to the right with the Greek mercenary hoplites, shielded by the Euphrates River. Next to them were the peltasts with cavalry behind them. Cyrus headed the center with his 600 heavily armed bodyguards and the Asian troops under the Persian general Arrhiaeus. Opposite the young rebel prince, Artaxerxes' army was arrayed out, their royal scion positioning himself dead center. Opposing Clearchus were Tissaphernes and the light cavalry, and next to them was the heavy cavalry of the Persians. To the right was a contingent of Egyptian cavalry, and surrounding Artaxerxes was a unit of his personal elite mounted bodyguards. Both armies were situated next to the Euphrates and a hill on the other side where the settlement was. Early in the afternoon, the battle commenced. The Artaxerxians began to push forwards, prompting Cyrus to move to the right flank, to order Clearchus to attack the enemy's center, where his brother was. Clearchus refused to follow these directions, seeing the overwhelming numbers on the other side of the field as too risky to engage with. Xenophon dashed to Cyrus's side, announcing the auspicious omens of victory from the sacrifices of the morning in the name of Zeus, prompting an enthusiastic Cyrus to return to the center. The Greeks then began to march to a war song towards the enemy. A part of the phalanx broke forward from the bristling formation because they were marching too fast and were excited, causing the others to rush behind them to secure the cohesion of the unit, shouting the name of the god Ares. This, alongside the bashing of their hoplite shields, struck fear into the hearts of some of the Persians, who began to flee, the Greeks chasing them swiftly and mercilessly. The Persians sent their chariots forwards, but the Greeks responded by merely sidestepping to let them pass. Cyrus continued to occupy the center as he moved forward, but the left flank was left inactive for uncertain reasons, possibly due to lack of discipline. As such, Artaxerxes sent said left flank forward to surround the Greeks. Cyrus understood the strategy and ran against him to prevent total encirclement. Cyrus engaged with Artaxerxes' royal bodyguard and caused them to flee. The rebel prince even hurled a javelin at his brother, which struck Artaxerxes in the chest, and then he pushed forward and managed to kill the leader of the royal guard, Artaxerxes. Enraged, Artaxerxes took up his javelin and threw it towards his treasonous brother. The javelin missed, but hit a dear friend of Cyrus, Seuthes. Cyrus's guards began to chase after Artaxerxes' guards, leaving the rebel prince on his own. The remaining guard engaged to save the Shahanshah, much like Hiazates and Ahuras, or the lesser heavenly and infernal creatures in Zoroastrianism, are said to fight for Ahura Mazda and Angra-Mainyu, or the good and evil deities of Zoroastrianism, respectively. It is in this brawl that Cyrus himself was mortally wounded. A Scythian healer and friend of Cyrus, called Artapatis, jumped off his horse to save him, but it was too late. According to Xenophon, this was possibly a ritual suicide. Xenophon unveiled his admiration and mourning for his benefactor, singing the praises of Cyrus as a noble and heroic king in these final moments. The Artaxerxean Persians then managed to take the rebel camp by sending their right flank around the back and encircling the camp. Plundering began immediately, and Cyrus's concubines began fleeing for their lives. The Greeks continued to march on their foe, unaware of the fact that their patron was dead. They chased the Persians further up the hill to the river's left. They took the hill easily, after which Kleachos sent down a messenger to check on the situation. The Greeks thought Cyrus was still alive, but soon discovered that the Prince of Persia, their patron and paymaster, was now slain. Upon hearing of the death of Cyrus, the rebels began to disperse in chaos and anguish, fearing the vengeance of the great king. The generals of the Greeks were scared for their lives and decided to ensure their return home. We must imagine the Hellenic army, deep in enemy territory, desperate at having been led into a doomed battle against the King of Kings by trickery, and then now being stranded in the ancient world's greatest superpower. The Greek generals resolved that their first measure would be to try to talk to Artaxerxes and hopefully gain clemency and a safe passage home. The Persians sent an envoy who they said could arrange a truce. Knowing it would be difficult for the Greeks to do anything else, they agreed to a truce. The Persians initially seemed optimistic about a peaceable outcome and mentioned to the Greeks that they would be let go. Tissaphernes also seemed keen to show kindness to the Greeks initially, providing them with food for them to have their breakfast. While toasted bread with olives and halloumi was being prepared, the Persians asked for further negotiations. The generals obliged, and Kleachos went to meet with Tissaphernes. The two generals began their discussion, with Kleachos explaining that they didn't know they were being hired for such a treasonous act. And if ever seized with rage we wished to kill on the way, what other deed did we wish? Or, having killed our benefactor, to go forth in a struggle against him in the flourishing of his forces, always expecting to be avenged by a great king? And of what and how many hopes they would be deprived of, if I should attempt, even in what way, to harm you, I will speak to you about this immediately. If I ever wished for Cyrus to be my friend, I did so because I thought he was the most capable of benefiting whoever he wished. Today, however, I see that you have under your power both the army of Cyrus and his country, and that you are now saving your authority, and that the royal military force, which Cyrus treated as his enemy, you now have as your ally. So, as things stand, will he be so mad as not to want to be your friend? Tissaphernes replied with assurances of safety for the Greeks, while showing that Artaxerxes was still powerful and could destroy the Greeks if need be, but also gave warnings of sycophants against Kleachos amongst the Greek ranks. But why, then, when it was easy for us to destroy you, did we not do so? Know well that the cause of this is my ardent desire to be seen as a friend to the Greek faithful. With that foreign army with which Cyrus went up, you bought his trust in him with wages. With this now I will go down to the shores mighty, winning his trust in me for favours. So, in how many circumstances can you be useful to me, you spoke? You only omitted one, the greatest one, the one I know, that of the heart. Because the king alone has the right to wear it on the head, but on the heart, perhaps another of you present here can carry it easily. As for me, if you wish to come here, both generals and captains, I will show you all those who accuse you of plotting against me and my army. Kleachos agreed to bring all generals along for negotiations, and to reveal the culprit, and sent forth the captains and generals alongside himself, Prosenos, Menon, Aegeus and Socrates. However, Tissaphernes was found to be lacking in one of the three virtues that Herodotus cherished the Persians for, speaking the truth. In a treacherous play, the satrap sent forth a contingent of cavalry which accosted and arrested the shocked Greek generals. They were tried for oath-breaking and executed. Xenophon spends some time discussing who these men were, and making moral analyses of why they were executed. Modern scholars often see this as Xenophon justifying his own later actions of taking their place as the leader of the Greek survivors. Indeed, when the remaining mercenaries congregated and elected new leaders, Xenophon was among them. As one of his first edicts, the warrior-turned-author proposed something he would become very well known for, a daring retreat. In a charismatic speech to his men, Xenophon claimed they had a high chance of survival, given that they were pious to the gods of Olympus, who would protect them. Considering that too much equipment would slow them down in the event of a Persian chase, he ordered that all but the bare necessities be destroyed, including livestock and extra equipment. This was done, and the army began to march back north, trying to reach the shore, and from there go home. Their goal was to reach the Carduchian mountains and find the source of the Tigris River. The rearguard was under the command of Xenophon, while the vanguard was under the leadership of the Spartan Chrysophos, one of the newly elected generals of the 10,000, alongside Damasian, Xanthicles, Cleonor, Phalisos and Xenophon himself. They reached the mountains at nightfall and tried to march through, while the Carduchians were lighting up many fires. The next morning, and after resting, the Greeks began their march once more, but the Carduchians, equipped with slingshots, began to terrorize the renegades. The Greeks continued their march as they were trying to gain control of the high ground hilltops and stop being under such duress from the Carduchians. Xenophon considered short stops during attacks to regroup the men, but Chrysophos considered this unnecessary, causing some confusion. The strategy was essentially taking a hill, regrouping, and then moving forward again, and Xenophon left some people behind to defend the hills as they moved. Having then reached a third hill, Xenophon considered setting up some defences there, but then some messengers told him they had lost the first hill and were being chased by the Carduchians. Eventually they reached a ravine, and people passed slowly through various small routes, shouting encouraging slogans to each other. Eventually they reached a relatively safe location and encamped for the night. Chrysophos and Xenophon buried their dead with full honours and presumably discussed their future strategy. Not having a guide was a difficult predicament, but the 10,000 decided to continue on the next day. As they did so, they continued being attacked by the Carduchian volleys, but managed to fight them off thanks to the Cretan contingent's excellent use of bows. After a while, they at last reached the end of the mountains and saw the river Kendrites, which was the separation between Armenia and Carduchia. The men were certainly relieved, but still had 7 stadias worth of distance to go. On the other side, Armenian, Mardaean and Chaldean horsemen were stationed, presumably eating the Armenian delicacy of lamakun in their mess halls. That night, Xenophon had a dream that he was with 2 young men tied by their legs, who proceeded to fall down and let him run fast to his goal. The religious Xenophon took this as a good omen, and during breakfast, 2 young men did report to him that they saw some civilians hiding provisions and clothes in a cave nearby the river. The troops split, with Chrysophos going through the river and Xenophon using a difficult pass to go through another route. This was a diversion plan, as Chrysophos attacked the soldiers on the other side and drew their attention. Xenophon used this opportunity to move towards them as the Carduchians were approaching from behind. Chrysophos managed to take the hills with some provisions in caves and sent peltasts towards Xenophon, who positioned himself near the river. As the peltasts arrived, Xenophon ordered an attack and promptly destroyed the enemy troops. Askik, the Armenian goddess of beauty, was lounging in her heavenly garden with her guests Aphrodite of the Greeks and Anahita of the Persians as they saw the Greeks pass into her territory. The local satrap Trapezus approached them on a horse and said he wanted to negotiate peaceful terms with them for their passage. The new generals agreed and began to march through the cold lands of Armenia. Trapezus was a cautious leader and proceeded to scout them with his army in case they misbehaved or burned any villages, a common fear for mercenary armies. The mountains were cold and treacherous, causing the Greeks much trouble, but they ended up passing through them and into a snowy valley. During their march, they had captured a Persian who claimed Trapezus was following them to attack them. Thus, they proceeded carefully until they saw an enemy camp, which they swiftly conquered. They eventually reached a village which was rather hospitable to them, a tradition that is common to this day throughout the Near East, the Caucasus and the Balkans. It was here that Xenophon acquired a horse, as the Greeks assisted the local Armenians with procuring the necessary horses for the annual tribute to the Shahanshah. Afterwards they continued, but Chrysophos was angry at the Persian guide because they stopped running into villages and beat him, even though the guide told them there were no villages in the region. The next day the guide was gone, and Xenophon rebuked Chrysophos for this blunder. Guideless, the 10,000 continued until they reached the northern edges of Armenia, where the formidable Taocians resided. The Taocians were a martial people and had fortresses in the region, one of which was by a pass they had to go through to reach the shore. The generals debated the matter during the dinner mess, with Cleonor mentioning they should take the fortress that night, but Xenophon counselled that this would cause more losses due to the darkness. This constant narrative of his own achievements seems to be deliberate, as one of Xenophon's motivations may have been to justify his actions and mistakes during the march, hence why Chrysophos is seen in a negative light constantly. In this case, however, all generals, including Chrysophos, agreed, and the next day, part of the army was set to climb the mountain and another was to go through the pass. Chrysophos pressed into the pass and engaged the enemy, defeating them in the first push. The Taocians realized the Greek treachery and split their army into two, one going down to defeat Chrysophos and another to fight the Greeks who had reached the ridge. However, the ridge Greeks fought them off easily and caused the entire army to flee. After 5 days of a long march, the Greeks finally reached the fortress, but they were without supplies. The locals, civilian and soldier alike, hurled stone volleys on the Greeks, who were bombarded and had to retreat. Seeing this standstill, Chrysophos waited for Xenophon, who was still behind in the rearguard, to arrive. It was decided that they should starve out the stone supplies of the enemy, and a Greek as cunning as Odysseus himself set himself near a pine tree and distracted them, jumping back and forth from the tree and causing volleys to be thrown at him. Eventually the volleys ran out, and the Greeks dashed in an assault on the fortress. The fight was then simple, as they broke through and entered the fortress. Fearing Hellenic vengeance, many civilians jumped off the cliffs in an act of desperation and perished in the ravine beneath. The Greeks took a few prisoners and then got all the supplies they needed. The sun gods, Mitra and Apollo, rode the sun as the Greeks passed through more treacherous territories, such as the Caribbeans and the Scythians. The former were apparently very formidable warriors, according to Xenophon. Eventually, the wealthy silver mining city of Gymnias provided them with both supplies and guidance to the Euxenos Pontos, or for us, the Black Sea. The Greeks continued marching for 5 days, but the march went through an enemy city of Gymnias, which they were requested to ravage. The Greeks promptly did so and continued. Finally, they glimpsed the salted waters that so much of Greek history owes its debt to. The Greeks began to shout gleefully at the beautiful sight of the sea, causing Xenophon to dash from the rearguard, thinking they were attacked. As they reached the top, however, they understood that the shouting actually was Thalata, Thalata, the Attic Greek rendering of the sea, the sea. We can only imagine how happy the Greeks were for finally reaching the familiar sea, even if it was not the Aegean, after months in a harsh hinterland such as Anatolia, land of 1,000 gods. Thanking the guide and giving him many rings, a horse and 10 derricks, they proceeded through to the land of Colchis, what we would call southern Georgia today. The Greeks, in need of provisions, looted the nearby villages and procured much wealth with the help of the local enemies, the Macronians. The Greeks continued their epic journey until they reached the city of Trapezus, a Hellenic colony initially of the Milesians. Finally, in fully friendly territory, the 10,000 rejoiced in their eventual success. To honor their odyssey, the Greeks held athletic games, a custom as old as the Iliad's games in honor of Patroclus, and conducted sacrifices to Heracles and Zeus. It is here that discussions on final repatriation began, though the Greeks didn't know they would still have to face more adventures on their journey home. The soldiers listened to Chrysophos, who mentioned he had a friend who could provide them with long ships. As the Spartan left, the Trapezountians came to the 10,000 with a proposal as old as any mercenary's tale: to plunder the nearby enemy territory of the Drille. The mercenaries did as they requested and plundered for their own supplies, not once thinking that they could perhaps be the baddies here. Eventually, as Chrysophos had not enough ships for everyone to return, they decided to use the few ships they did have to send the women and children, as well as the eldest generals such as Phalisios and Sophenitos, back to Hellas. The rest of the Hellenes had to find another way, and for that they decided to march across the shore. It is during this interlude that Xenophon's religiosity comes to the fore, as he discusses the temple to Artemis he was to construct back in Greece with parts of the bounty from the raids on Colchis. On the site of Skilunta near Olympia, Xenophon was to retire and build a sanctuary in honor of Artemis, taking inspiration and emulation of the Ephesian temple to the same deity. This temple had annual feasts for the entire city to partake in, with Xenophon as the first guardian of the temple. Around the temple, beautiful groves were planted to make the temple worthy of the goddess of the hunt and moon, and the local citizens provided a tenth of their fruits as an annual sacrifice during the feast. Xenophon's religiosity may be due to his upbringing in a very superstitious Athens, or it could be due to genuine gratitude for having survived such a treacherous journey back home, or even a sort of justification for his wealth and success. Nevertheless, Xenophon also provided a tenth of the booty to the twin brother of Artemis, the god Apollo. The 10,000 continued their march across the northern shores of Anatolia. Moving from Kerasunta, they managed to reach the land of the Mossynokians. The locals saw the Greeks and agreed to give them safe passage on one very familiar condition: to assist them in fighting off their enemies on the way. The 10,000 were so good at marching that they took the capital after the foes had fled. They thus divided the material amongst themselves and their allies and continued on their way to find Sinope. When they eventually reached the city, they again held games in honor of the Olympians. The ambassadors of the Sinopeans arrived and were received by the 10,000, giving them advice on how to proceed. They recommended to the Greeks to go by sea, but this would require going into the territory of the Paphlagonians, who may not be friendly towards them. The soldiers discussed this amongst themselves and eventually agreed to take the sea route. The Sinopeans agreed to assist them with some guidance and supplies in order to ensure their speedy expedition to Greece. While this was happening, sycophants among the 10,000 had begun to question Xenophon's abilities and objectives. A certain Boeotian, Thorax, was constantly bickering with Xenophon, at least if we take the latter at his word. As the men began to act restlessly, unsure of Xenophon's ability to send them home, he rushed to defend himself. His speech implored them to listen to him as his plan was divinely sanctioned. "I hear, soldiers, that someone is bringing a charge against me, namely that I am going to deceive you and lead you to the Phasis. In the name of the gods, then, give ear to my words, and if it appears that I am guilty of wrong, I ought not to leave this spot without paying the penalty. But if it appears to you that my accusers are guilty of wrong, they ought to be dealt with in such manner as they deserve. You doubtless know," he continued, "where the sun rises and where it sets. Likewise, that if a man is to go to Greece, he must journey toward the west, while if he wishes to go to the lands of the barbarians, he must travel in the opposite direction, that is, toward the east. Now is there anyone who could deceive you in this matter by maintaining that the place where the sun rises is the one where it sets, and the place where it sets is the one where it rises? Again, you surely know this also, that the north wind carries one out of the Euxine to Greece, while the south wind carries you within, to the Phasis. Indeed, the saying is, when the north wind doth blow, fair voyaging to Greece. In this matter, again, is it possible that anyone could deceive you into embarking when the south wind is blowing? But I am going to put you aboard, you may say, when it is calm. Well, I shall be sailing on one ship, you on 100 at least. How then could I either force you to voyage along with me if you did not choose, or deceive you into following my lead? But suppose you have been deceived and bewitched by me, and we have come to the Phasis. We accordingly disembark upon the shore. You will perceive, likely enough, that you are not in Greece, and I, who have done the deceiving, will be one lone man, while you, the deceived, will be close to 10,000 with arms in your hands. Then how could a man bring down punishment upon himself more surely than by planning in that way for himself and for you?" Xenophon's impassioned speech ensured his success, and the soldiers soon agreed with him. They decided to push forward as planned. Xenophon had the ringleaders punished. The narrative is certainly biased towards Xenophon, as he is the author of the text which we are discussing. We see here his attempt at praising himself, building up his virtues and honesty as guarantees of his skills both as commander and as leader. These skills, certainly products of his aristocratic education, make the Anabasis intriguing as an insight into the psyche of Xenophon and his philosophy of religion as well as leadership. The Greeks had passed through a large landmass, but had to satiate their nostos, or homesickness. Xenophon had proven himself to be a capable leader, but his biggest adventures were yet to come. The 10,000 began to sail towards Paphlagonia. This ancient nation, listed as an ally of the Trojans in the Iliad, was actually rather diplomatic in its engagement with the 10,000. The generals of Paphlagonia agreed to host them and threw a lavish starlight feast replete with ritual sacrifices. Here, various local dances were displayed, such as the dance of Ctolcus, a Thracian hero, and a dance of thieves put on by the Magnesians. The next day, the 10,000 agreed to pass through the region without harming anyone, and thus went to the Greek colony of Sinope. As they were travelling, a disagreement amongst the troops arose as to who would be ideal to manage the rest of the trip. Tensions were arising, for instance, about whether it was proper for Lacedaemonians to command Athenians and vice versa. Disagreements on the use of land or sea routes also ensued, and as such, different itineraries were set up. The army was split into three, each with different travel plans. The Arcadians and Achaeans took ships to pillage the nearby Bithynians on the southern edge of the Black Sea. Chrysophos and his troops began to march to the city of the Heracleonians, while Xenophon took ships and decided to go to the border of Thrace and Heraclea before continuing on foot towards the hinterland. The first group launched their first raids in Thracian territory in the settlement of Calpis, but some Thracian peltasts struck back, showering them with missile fire. Chrysophos later went to Calpis and settled there. Meanwhile, when Xenophon was marching, they bumped into some local elders who told him what had happened. In response, Xenophon brought his men close to the Arcadian contingent and camped near the port of the city. In the meantime, Chrysophos died after drinking bad medicine, an unceremonious end to his career. The Greeks then decided to regroup and try to go home together. But before they proceeded on this next leg of the journey, the sacrificial signs they sought were not favourable, giving the superstitious troops reason for concern. Xenophon, who was accused of rigging the sacrifices to build a colony there, assuming him to be exploiting them for his ambitions, spoke to the soldiers and compelled them to leave their supplies and go to a proper spot to fight their way to their comrades, as both groups were trapped in Thracian territory and considered raiders. Chrysophos' replacement sent out for supplies via looting nearby villages, but they were attacked by Persian troops led by Pharnabazos, who had arrived in the area. That night, during mess time, the Bithynians attacked once more, and the fear of another attack caused the Greeks to spend the night on guard. The next day, they took a defensive position, and after collecting and burying their dead, they tried to find food. Then they once again found Persian troops sent by Pharnabazos, led by Spiridates and Rathmenes. Finally seeing good entrail signs, Xenophon ordered that backup lochi be set up behind the vanguard to fill in any gaps. The soldiers agreed, and Xenophon began to march through the canyon where the enemy lay, mounted on a horse. The peltasts went first, attacking the Persians, who marched forward on horseback to chase them away. Shouting, "Zeus Saviour, Heracles Guide," the infantry of the Greeks moved forward with their spears in their hands. The Persians immediately began to run away at the sight, and the Greeks were victorious. Sometime later, Cleandros returned with 2 triremes, but after a misunderstanding, a soldier was falsely accused of trying to steal some sheep. Cleandros was furious, but the soldier was saved by the head of his lochos, Agasius. A furious Cleandros demanded he be stoned, but Xenophon intervened, and after some debate, the spirits calmed down, and the entire army went to Chrysopolis. Helios, the Greek god of the sun, and Salmoxis, the deity of the Thracians, were having Greek coffee as they watched the 10,000 arrive at their destination. After lodging in Chrysopolis, whose name incidentally means Gold Town, the 10,000 continued on their way. However, from the fields of Asphodel, Chrysophos must have been laughing because before he died, he had encountered a Spartan general called Anaxibios, who at the time was on an expedition against Persia. Chrysophos had promised that the 10,000 would assist Anaxibios in his campaign, but Pharnabazos had actually bribed Anaxibios, and he tried to send them away with promises of pay. Anabasis later announced to other forces in the region that their capture meant they could be sold as slaves, thus placing a bounty on them. The 10,000 were furious and began to fight back into Chrysopolis, chasing the traitorous Spartan. Xenophon, who had relinquished his command to a certain Coeritadus and was prepared to go home, intervened once more at the request of Anabasis. As if this wasn't already a lot like a Greco-Persian soap opera, it turned out that Pharnabasos was no longer interested in the deal with Anabasis, as he was no longer Navarch due to his shenanigans and the arrival of the Spartan Harmost Aristarchos, and as such did not listen to Anabasis' messengers reminding him of the agreement. So, in revenge, Anabasis tried to convince Xenophon to invade Pharnabasos' satrapy. Xenophon agreed to this, and to that end, decided to ask for military assistance from the local Thracian lord Seuthes. Seuthes was a shrewd negotiator, demanding Xenophon and his soldiers gain some territory for him, in exchange for which he would provide provisions for his campaign against Pharnabasos. After some pillaging, it was time for a pay collection, but trouble was afoot. There was not enough money to pay the Greeks what was promised, which caused the mercenaries to accuse Xenophon of embezzlement. Xenophon rebuked the accusation and deflected the blame onto an intermediary called Heraclides. Meanwhile, Seuthes was begging Xenophon to stay and continue fighting for him. Xenophon decided, as usual, to ask the Olympians whether or not this was a good idea. After failing to reach them via email, he consulted through sacrifices once more, whereupon it was determined that the omens were favourable to them leaving Thrace. This was good timing, for another local king, called Medosides, was presently retaking the territory the Greeks were pillaging, and was demanding they leave. As such, the general went to Seuthes and demanded enough pay for them to leave. Seuthes finally agreed, and armed with money and provisions, the Greeks began their march home. Xenophon managed to distribute the money fairly amongst the troops, enabling them to finally reap the fruits of their labour. Athena, goddess of war and wisdom of the Greeks, was polishing her shield as the 10,000 got upon their ships and sailed once more to the city of Lampsakos on the tip of the Bosporus. Here, the locals received them eagerly, providing them with many gifts and lavish hospitality. While in Lampsakos, an oracle called Euclides was invited by Xenophon to check the entrails of a sacrifice to the god Apollo. Euclides told the general that it was not Apollo but Zeus who was not allowing him to return home. Xenophon realized that, of all the Olympians, he had forgotten to offer sacrifice to the father of the gods, and promptly did so on the next day. The 10,000 then continued to move to the south to the former territory of the Kingdom of Troy, then crossed Mount Eden and moved to camp in the city of Pergamon, near the modern city of Izmir. It was there that the 10,000, as true students of Athena's arts of war, came across their final challenge when they heard of a local Persian notable called Asidatis who was dwelling in the valley. This was a very rich noble whose money could help fund the 10,000's final journey home. All Xenophon required, as his interlocutors told him, was 300 men, and he could capture Asidatis, his family, and all of his property. Xenophon did the same thing he always did, try to double-check with the Olympians. The oracle he consulted this time, Basis the Hellenian, checked the entrails and gave the 10,000 the all-clear. After a fine dinner with his comrades, presumably of souvlaki with pita bread and a dose of gyros and herbs, Xenophon took his favourite captains and set forth towards the valley with 600 of their best men. The 10,000 arrived at around midnight, as the goddess of ghosts Melanoe was coming out with her entourage of shades. Unfortunately for them, they were terrible at catching animals and soldiers at night, most of whom escaped them. They then proceeded to a guard tower on the perimeter of Asidatis' estate and laid siege to it. This was not successful either, due to its height and the spirited defense of the personnel within. As such, the Greeks tried the Italian job approach by trying to dig below it. This failed as well, as someone from within utilized a spike and murdered one of the assailants who was close by. The launchers nearby in the tower could not attack further, and the assailants asked for Xenophon's aid. However, it was Achaemenes who came to their aid with the cavalry of the Assyrians and Hyrcanians and helped them gain the upper hand. The attackers used their position to capture all of the cattle and slaves of Asidates, and then Xenophon proceeded to leave the position in a circular formation. The defenders were constantly barraging them with volleys of arrows and slingshots, which caused the Greeks much distress. They received help from Procles, a Spartan who was ruling the region on behalf of the Persians, and Gongylus, a local who had given them assistance previously. It was thus that Asidates' cattle and wealth, as well as many slaves, were captured. The next day, Xenophon offered sacrifices to the gods once more, while Asidates, terrified the Greeks would return and capture him, escaped from his tower and hid in some nearby villages. However, the Greeks were as shrewd as their hero Odysseus and got wind of this. At once they dashed to his location and seized him, his wife and his children. And thus, the final adventure was won. The Greeks returned to Pergamon, where they engaged with the local Spartans, who were there on a campaign against the Persians. The Spartan general Thimbron, who had just arrived with his troops, was happy to meet the 10,000 and welcomed them heartily. Xenophon then resigned his leadership and allowed any of his troops who wished to join the Spartan campaign to do so. The Spartans then proceeded to fight against Tissaphernes and Pharnabazos. The text ends here, though we may suspect that Xenophon continued to fight for the Spartans, as his other book, Hellenica, describes these battles in detail. However, this is where our story must end. In the final paragraph, Xenophon gives us an overview of the regions he campaigned in. The governors of all the king's territories that we traversed were as follows: Artemis of Lydia, Artacamus of Phrygia, Mithridates of Lycaonia and Cappadocia, Sienices of Cilicia, Dernes of Phoenicia and Arabia, Belesys of Syria and Assyria, Roparis of Babylon, Arbaces of Media, Tiribazus of the Phasians and Hesperites, then the Carduchians, Calibians, Chaldeans, Macronians, Calicians, Mossynoecians, Coetians and Tibarenians, who were independent, and then Corylus, governor of Paphlagonia, Pharnabazus of the Bithynians, and Seuthes of the Thracians in Europe. The length of the entire journey, upward and downward, was 215 stages, 1,150 parasangs, or 34,255 stadia, and the length in time, upward and downward, a year and 3 months. Thus our story comes to a close. Xenophon's adventures probably continued under Thimbron, and then under his replacement Deicletus. Eventually a Spartan king arrived, the fabled Agesilaus, whom Xenophon met and befriended. The two most likely campaigned together until 394 BCE, when they marched back home to Sparta. Xenophon settled in an estate granted to him by Agesilaus in the region of Skylos, living a comfortable life supported with money from his war spoils. Since Xenophon ended up fighting on the Spartan side in the Battle of Chaeronea, the Athenians banished him from the city, which perhaps is a motivation for his writing these events to justify his actions. Eventually, in 371 BCE, after the Battle of Leuctra, Xenophon's estate was confiscated, after which, according to the much later historian Diogenes Laertios, he moved to Corinth, where he died in 354 BCE. In the later stages of his life, he wrote many more texts on matters such as leadership and the histories of Hellas, as well as treatises on education, such as the Chiropedia or the Education of Cyrus the Great. This text is a fictionalized account of the education of the Shahanshah and how this defined his rulership and the relationship between Medes and Persians. Xenophon's philosophy, forged by both his aristocratic background and his martial experiences, meant that he had a conservative outlook on life. For instance, his encomion, or praise of Agesilaus, makes the case that his virtue and magnanimity made him an ideal ruler. He also had his son go through the Spartan education system, or the Agohi, where Spartan children lived through a harsh, militaristic education from age 7 to age 30. As such, Xenophon was an anti-democrat, instead preferring what he considered to be the more meritocratic systems of Persia under Cyrus and the mixed constitution of Sparta. Consequently, Xenophon provided us with some of the best information on the society of the Spartan city-state, as his Polity of the Lacedaemonians is one of our main sources on how the intricacies of the society worked in terms of military, governance, economy, and social relations. The mercenary, philosopher, enterprising adventurer, and raider that was Xenophon is just as well known as Thucydides and Herodotus, though his reception has been especially strong in terms of his political philosophy by contemporary thinkers such as Leo Strauss. His Anabasis of Xenophon is both emotional in its tension and captivating in its adventurous pace. With its unique storyline structure, it reads as much like a novel than an annalistic account of history, with drama, conflict, and interpersonal struggles of individuals carrying the story. It can be seen as a treatise on leadership, or as a treatise on survival and military strategy. Ultimately, we can propose that it gives us an insight into the mind of Xenophon, as well as provides us with an overview of Persia, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, which, while not as detailed as Herodotus's often fanciful yet surprising anthropological insights, helps us with seeing how people behaved in war and in the presence of mercenaries. It is as such a tale of adventure and intrigue for fortune, but also a tale of the philosophical development of our author. It is as much a Persian, an Armenian, a Thracian, and an Anatolian tale as it is a Greek one. For without the Persian politicians who set the wheels in motion, it would not have happened, and without local interlocutors, the mercenaries would not have survived. Despite the constant nostos, or homesickness in the text, perhaps it is the journey that was more important than the destination for Xenophon. We must thus end our tale with the words of a Persian, Farid ud-Din, a Persian Sufi poet who resided in Nishapur, who perished as a civilian in a war by the Mongols. His Conference of the Birds would find some resonance with the Greek general. The ocean can be yours, why should you stop? Beguiled by dreams of evanescent dew. The secrets of the sun are yours, but you content yourself with motes trapped in its beams. Turn to what truly lives, reject what seems. Which matters more, the body or the soul? Be whole, desire and journey to the whole. Rumi and Xenophon would also find agreement with the Constantinopolitan-turned-Alexandrian Greek poet Constantine Cavafy. A gay Greek poet of the 19th century, a stranger in a strange land, with a worldview of cultivated cosmopolitanism, Cavafy's poem Ithaca is something that Xenophon may very well have agreed with. Keep Ithaca always in your mind. Arriving there is what you're destined for, but don't hurry the journey at all. Better if it lasts for years, so you're old by the time you reach the island, wealthy with all you've gained on the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. More videos on the history of Greece are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.